Hey folks, so in this video I wanted to do a quick demo on Devcontainers and how they can help you quickly prototype without having to worry about dependency management. So first things first, we need to have a Docker environment installed. I use OrbStack as my Docker desktop alternative, but if you want you can also just install Docker Desktop. And also for all of our examples we'll be running VS Code because it just has the tightest integration with Devcontainers. So let's dive in. So we want to build two kind of applications. A Golang API that's backed by a Postgres database, and some front end, I'm thinking like Astro, that connects to that API. I am going to open up the Golang API in VS Code. Let's resize this a little bit. So there's nothing in this folder right now, it's empty. So I can start with adding a dev container. So we can open up the command palette, start typing in dev containers, and open folder in container. And what VS Code is going to do is see that there's no dev container configuration in this folder, so it's now going to let us add that. I'm going to select this Go and Postgres image, and we'll select the latest image. There's also a feature here. We are going to talk about features in a second, but we will be adding the get from source feature in a later step. So for now, I'm not going to select anything, and we're just going to continue through. Cool. So now this whole VS Code environment is opened up inside a dev container. So we have Golang API Dependencies. You can see the text has changed at the top, and everything we do is actually running inside the container. So I can do git version, go version here, and if I try and do a go version on my local machine, well, that won't work. So we know that this VS Code instance is inside the container. Now, VS Code has set up a few files for us. So we have a devcontainer.json, which is a spec. And this spec is really the core of a dev container. It lets us define customizations, features that we can use for development specifically. This spec talks to pulls in a Docker Compose, which just has two services, a app and a DB. And also there's a Docker file that contains the Golang image. The Docker Compose file has this whole workspace mounted on our local machine, so any changes we make in our dev container we can see on our local machine and vice versa. So for example, if I do main.go here, switch back to my terminal, I can see that main.go is now my local machine. So now that we have this file, let's actually get some code in here. I'm just going to copy and paste for time. It's not the prettiest Go code, but all it's doing right now is creating an album struct. It's connecting to the database, and it also has two routes to get all the albums and to create a new album. So we can start initializing all of this. Okay, let's go get the dependencies. And let's run our server. So our server's up and running, so we can kind of curl. We can see that, hey, there's some logs here. We can create an album. Again, we're getting logs. And if we run that curl, we can get our album back. So great, that's basically our server. That's all we really need to do for now. So we can be good programmers, and let's actually commit this. So do I have Git? I do have Git, but actually 2.47.0 is a old version. So let's actually bring in the newest version of Git, and we can do that using features. So we can start typing features here, and I'm actually going to go pull the feature from the dev container features list. So containers.dev/features, and I can link these URLs in the description. It has just a bunch of available features. So this is the list that you saw when you're opening up in VS Code. We can see that get from source is what we want, so we can pull this feature in here. And we can see it has 8 options, so we can pass in a version. So I'm actually going to pass in a version, and I actually want the latest VS Code version. Sorry, I want the latest Git version. So let's rebuild this container now. And now what it's going to do is it's going to install this Git feature on top of our base image. And what that installation really looks like is just this script. So the dev container inside VS Code is just going to run the script on top of a base image. And now if I do git version, I can see that I have the latest version 247.1 instead of 247.0. So now we want to git init this, and I can see I already have some issues here. If I commit, it tells me that, hey, I don't know who you are. So you need to add this to your git config. Now we could go ahead and do this manually, but a better way is to actually just copy the git config from our local machine. So I went and reopened the folder locally. So now this is my Golang API folder running on my local machine. I'm going to go to VS Code settings and start typing git config. And then I can select this option here. So devcontainers copy git config. This just copies my git config from my local machine onto the dev container. So now let's rebuild and reopen in container. Cool. And if I commit now, great, I can commit. Initial commit. And I can also just cat my config to make sure it has information, and it does. Great, so that's all we really need to do for this Golang API. Let's switch over to the front end. So we're going to run through similar steps, opening up front end encode. Let's resize this. And then we're going to open in the command palette, select devcontainers, open folder in container. Clicking through here at configuration, we're going to select a node and TypeScript container image. We aren't going to select any features for now. Again, we'll click through all of those things. Great, so now we have a node devcontainer and we want to start an Astro app. So I'm going to run npm create Astro latest to get Astro installed. We need to install a package. Okay, I'm going to select the default folder here. Basically, the create Astro requires an empty directory to create in. So that means that I'm not going to install dependencies. I'm not going to initialize a Git repository because we'll move all of these files back into this root folder. So I can select all of these, move them back out into the root folder, and we can just remove that temp folder. And now I can run npm install. Great, so now that our packages are installed, we can get this app up and running. So if we app run dev, I have this localhost URL, you see that it's not loading, and that's because with Astro, and honestly this is a Vite option, we need to pass in -- host. So if we have a look at package.json, we can pass in host here. We have to reload the server here, and now we have a network URL that we can use. And if we refresh our localhost here, localhost 4321, we can see that we've now connected to our Astro localhost. So let's go ahead and start adding some albums. So we have a component. We're going to create a new album Astro component. I'm going to copy and paste some code again, and we'll just go through it. And also in index, instead of welcome, we are going to pull in album singular, and we're going to replace this welcome component with the album component. And all this is doing is fetching the data from this host.docker.internal. So this is from a container with the port 8080, and then it'll just display the data in a table. So before we can do that, let's actually first run our server. So we're going to pull the dependencies again, and then we're just going to run go run. Cool, our server's up and running. So if I go back to localhost now, refresh, I can see that, hey, I have albums. And if I go and create like a new album here, we can create the same one. I refresh, it's there now. So what would be really nice is syntax highlighting here. So we could install the Astro plugin, and that would actually solve our problems, right? So now we have an Astro component, we have syntax highlighting, great. But if we rebuild this container, that extension just gets like wiped. So we don't have any syntax highlighting when we reopen our container. So let's fix that by opening up the devcontainer.json, and we can select some customizations. So these customizations specify customizations for your editor. For our use case, we want to install in VS Code. In the extensions, we want to always install the Astro extension. So I'm going to search for Astro here. We're going to click this gear icon and just select copy extension ID. Put that in a string. So now this Devcontainer spec is defining that every time we open this Devcontainer, we'll go ahead and we'll install the Astro VS Code extension. So if I rebuild the container now, wait for a second, we can see, hey, now we have syntax highlighting. So there we have it, a front end and a Golang API. I have one more example I want to show you. What's one annoying thing with this Astro site is we needed to run npm create Astro and set up some set up some temporary folder and then move all those files out of the temporary folder into this main folder. So the only way, like the happy path would be run npm create Astro and then add the Devcontainer folder afterwards. But we can't do that because if I run npm create Astro here, I need to have Node installed, so I have to manage dependencies. And the Rails team has kind of seen this issue as well. For example, like if I run Rails new app, I can pass in a Devcontainer flag, and this will create a Rails configuration with Devcontainers. But to get to this stage, I need to install Ruby. I also need to install Rails, and that's like not the simplest thing. So there's actually a tool, Rails-new. So this runs Rails with inside like a Ruby container. So I don't need to have the latest Ruby installed, and I don't need to have Rails installed. So if I actually have a look at my Ruby, this is running at 2.6. And if I do Rails-new help, you see it defaults to 3.3.4 Ruby and defaults Rails to 7.2. So if I create a Rails new app here and also pass in the Devcontainer flag, you can see it's pulling down like a Docker image container, and then it's going to run Rails new. It's going to create my folder. It's going to bundle, install everything. And once that's done, I can actually open this folder up in a Devcontainer. So now it's done, I'm going to run code my app. And I'm going to reopen in container. Cool. And that's now connecting. It's running a bunch of stuff. It's going to run this like bin setup script. So it's installing gems again. Once those gems are installed, it's just preparing the database. And now we have a Rails app running inside a Devcontainer. So I can do bin Rails server, and I can get started with like goes 3000. So it was pretty fast to get from like 0 to getting started with Rails. And that's the beauty of Devcontainers. And there's one last thing that I'll show you as well. Is this prompt. You know, it's not quite the prompt I like. I would like to customize this prompt. And there's an option to do that within VS Code. So if I reopen this folder locally, and let's open up settings again, and we can go with .files. So if you search for .files, there's a few options here, but .files repository is what you want. So if you pass in a URL to a .files repository, it will clone that repository, and then it will run this install command, which is by default install.sh. So I actually have a .files repo. I'm just going to copy and paste this, get rid of tree.main, save this extension, and I'm going to rebuild and reopen in container. So I can open up a terminal, and I can see, hey, now my terminal is configured for my use, right? So this is customized to my .files. And yeah, that's all I want to show you. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Thank you so much for watching.